The planet's twin suns cast a strange, golden light over the towering palace that loomed before Marcus. It was unlike anything he had ever seen on Earth, its spires twisted into the sky like spiraling vines of steel, covered in shimmering scales that reflected the sun's light, creating an almost hypnotic effect. As he walked toward the entrance, the weight of his situation pressed down on him. His heart pounded in his chest, and the cool air of this alien world did little to soothe the tension gripping his mind. He had come here as a representative of Earth, sent to establish peaceful relations with the alien queen, who ruled this distant civilization. The mission was supposed to be straightforward diplomacy, trade agreements, mutual understanding. But the moment he stepped foot on the queen's soil, Marcus knew something was off. The people of this world had greeted him with cold, calculating gazes, their strange, iridescent eyes studying him as though he were some kind of exotic specimen. Now, as he approached the massive iron doors of the queen's palace, flanked by two towering alien guards in silver armor, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into something far beyond his control. The doors opened with a low groan, revealing a cavernous hall lined with statues of alien rulers long past. The architecture was breathtaking, alien in every sense, carved from black stone veined with luminous minerals that pulsed with an almost heartbeat-like rhythm. The light danced across the floor in slow, mesmerizing waves, casting eerie shadows across Marcus's path. At the far end of the hall, seated upon an imposing throne of polished obsidian, was the alien queen. Her regal figure was draped in robes of dark, shimmering fabric that seemed to flow like water over her body. Her skin was a deep shade of purple, smooth and flawless, her eyes two pools of molten gold that glowed with an inner fire. She radiated power, authority, and something far more unsettling, a cold, distant cruelty. "Welcome, Marcus of Earth," the queen's voice echoed through the hall, silky and commanding. "I trust your journey here was not too arduous." Marcus swallowed hard, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Thank you, Your Majesty. It was an honor to be chosen as Earth's representative to your great kingdom." The queen's lips curved into a small, almost predatory smile. "Indeed, we have waited long for this day. The moment when Earth would finally reach out to us, seeking alliance." She rose gracefully from her throne, descending the steps toward him with a slow, deliberate pace, her gaze never leaving his. The air grew thick as she approached, the weight of her presence suffocating. Marcus resisted the urge to take a step back as she stopped mere feet from him, towering over him despite her slender frame. "I have prepared a contract," she said softly, her voice almost a purr, "a binding agreement between our peoples, one that will ensure peace, prosperity, and protection for both of our worlds." Marcus nodded, grateful that the queen had come to the point so quickly. He had been briefed extensively about the need for diplomacy, the importance of securing an agreement with this ancient and powerful civilization. Still, something about the way she said binding sent a shiver down his spine. With a wave of her hand, a thin, metallic scroll materialized out of thin air, hovering between them. It unraveled with a soft hiss, its surface etched with strange, glowing symbols that Marcus could barely decipher. As he looked closer, his heart sank. None of the symbols were in a language he understood. "Please read carefully," the queen said, her eyes gleaming. "It is customary for both parties to fully understand the terms before signing." Marcus hesitated, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "I'm afraid I don't recognize this script." The queen's smile didn't falter. "It is an ancient language, one that cannot be easily understood by outsiders. But worry not. I will summarize for you. It simply outlines the protection and cooperation between our people, as well as your loyalty to my kingdom during your stay. In return, we shall offer you safe passage, resources, and the full support of our empire." Her words sounded reasonable, but Marcus couldn't shake the unease that crept up his spine. The contract shimmered, the alien symbols pulsing faintly, as though alive. His instincts screamed at him not to sign, but the weight of the moment, the pressure of his diplomatic mission, bore down on him. There was no real choice. With a deep breath, Marcus reached out and pressed his thumb to the contract's surface. The moment his skin made contact, the symbols flared with a blinding light. A sharp, burning sensation shot through his hand, spreading up his arm like wildfire. He gasped, but the pain was gone as quickly as it had come. The contract sealed itself with a soft whisper, the symbols fading into the air like smoke. "Good," the queen said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "It is done." Marcus clenched his hand, still feeling the lingering heat from the contract. Something was wrong, he could feel it deep in his bones. But before he could speak, the queen gestured toward a set of doors behind her throne. Now, as part of the agreement, there is one more matter to attend to, she continued, her tone growing colder, more clinical. You will meet my daughter, Leora. She will be your companion during your stay here. Marcus blinked, confusion knitting his brow. Companion. The queen's smile widened, but it was devoid of warmth. Yes, you see, Marcus, we value the future of our race above all else. Our bloodline is sacred, but it has grown, stagnant over the millennia. It is my belief that your human genes will revitalize our people, bring new strength to our future generations. The full weight of her words crashed down on him. His breath caught in his throat as the realization dawned this was no ordinary contract. He had signed away not just his freedom, but his very body. The queen had trapped him in a fate he never could have imagined, one where his role was not just that of a diplomat, but as a breeding tool for the royal bloodline. This wasn't in the agreement, Marcus stammered, his voice thick with shock. I didn't agree to. You did, the queen interrupted, her eyes flashing dangerously. You signed the contract of your own free will, and now you belong to me, to this kingdom. Refusal to comply would be unwise. Her words dripped with threat, leaving no room for argument. Marcus's mind raced, heart pounding in his chest. His first instinct was to run, to escape the oppressive grip of this alien monarch. But where could he go? He was deep in unfamiliar territory, with no allies, no resources, and no way to leave the planet. The queen turned away from him, her robes swirling around her like dark smoke. Do not worry, Marcus. My daughter is most agreeable. I'm sure you two will get along famously. At her command, the doors behind her opened silently, and a figure stepped forward. Marcus's breath caught as he beheld Leora for the first time. She was nothing like her mother. Where the queen was cold and commanding, Leora radiated warmth and curiosity. Her emerald green skin shimmered in the dim light, and her long, flowing hair was the color of silver moonlight. Her eyes, deep and bright like twin stars, met his with a mixture of uncertainty and sadness. She walked with grace but also reluctance, as if every step toward him weighed heavily on her soul. There was something in her gaze, pity, perhaps, or regret. Marcus couldn't tell, but he could feel the burden she carried, the same burden he now shared. Leora, the queen said, her voice softening only slightly, this is Marcus. He will be the one to help secure our future. Leora glanced at her mother before looking back at Marcus. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and in that instant Marcus knew they were both prisoners in this gilded cage. I'm sorry, Leora whispered, so softly that only Marcus could hear. Her voice was filled with genuine sorrow, a quiet plea for understanding. The queen smiled once more, oblivious to the silent exchange between them. Now, I leave you two to get acquainted. There is much to discuss about the future of our people. With that, she turned and left the room, her long robes trailing behind her like shadows, leaving Marcus and Leora alone in the vast, echoing hall. For a long moment neither spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, with the weight of the future that had been forced upon them. Marcus felt anger, fear, and confusion battling for control within him, but one glance at Leora's downcast expression tempered his rage. She was a victim too, caught in the same web of duty and manipulation. I didn't ask for this, Marcus said quietly, his voice hoarse. Leora's eyes flickered with understanding. Neither did I. And in that shared moment of vulnerability, Marcus realized that his fight for freedom had only just begun, his, and perhaps Leora's as well. Together they were bound by the queen's cruel contract, but beneath the surface, a fragile alliance was beginning to form. One that might just be their only hope of survival. The days that followed were a haze of confusion and unease for Marcus. He moved through the corridors of the palace like a ghost, every footstep echoing in the vast halls of cold, alien stone. The weight of the contract he had signed, a binding pact that had sealed his fate, hung over him like a storm cloud. His mind raced with questions, his heart heavy with a sense of betrayal. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? How had a mission of diplomacy turned into an unthinkable entrapment? The queen had made it clear refusal wasn't an option. And now Marcus found himself a prisoner of sorts, though the queen never used the word. It was exactly what he was, His quarters, while luxurious by any standard, felt like a gilded cage. The walls were smooth and curved as if grown rather than built, shimmering with the same strange minerals that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. Large, arched windows opened out to the alien landscape beyond, where the twin suns hung in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the horizon. From this vantage, Marcus could see the vast sprawl of the Queen's capital city, a labyrinth of alien architecture and towering structures that dwarfed anything he had ever seen on Earth. And yet, despite the opulence, despite the breathtaking views and the comfort of his surroundings, Marcus felt trapped. Each time he ventured into the palace, he could feel the eyes of the guards on him, watching his every move. His freedom was an illusion, a facade carefully crafted by the Queen to give him just enough space to prevent him from revolting, but not enough to ever truly escape her control. As the days dragged on, Marcus found himself increasingly restless. His mind churned with thoughts of escape, but he knew better than to act rashly. He had no idea where he was in relation to the planet's spaceports, or even if there was a way off the planet at all. For all he knew, the Queen could have grounded any ships capable of interstellar travel, trapping him in her kingdom with no hope of return. But it wasn't just his physical imprisonment that gnawed at him. The weight of the Queen's plan for him, the expectation that he would sire a new bloodline, left him feeling used, objectified in a way he had never imagined. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't signed up for any of it. The thought of being reduced to nothing more than a tool for the Queen's ambition turned his stomach. And then there was Leora. The Queen's daughter was a mystery, a quiet, ethereal presence in the palace. She was nothing like her mother, where the Queen was cold, manipulative, and calculating. Leora seemed more withdrawn, almost sorrowful. Marcus had only seen her a few times since their initial meeting, but in those brief encounters, he had sensed something deeper behind her emerald eyes. There was a sadness there, a burden that she too carried, though what it was, he couldn't yet say. It wasn't until one evening, as the twin suns dipped low on the horizon, that Marcus found himself truly alone with Leora for the first time. He had been pacing the length of his quarters, trying to shake the restless energy that had plagued him all day, when the door slid open with a soft hiss. Leora stepped into the room, her green skin catching the last rays of the suns, casting her in a soft, golden light. She wore a simple gown of dark blue fabric, its intricate patterns shimmering with the same faint glow as the walls. Her silver hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp lines of her face, but there was something different about her tonight, something vulnerable. Marcus turned to face her, surprised by her sudden appearance. Leora. She paused in the doorway, as though uncertain whether to enter, her eyes scanning the room before settling on him. For a long moment they stood in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Leora said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I thought we should talk." Her words took Marcus by surprise. In the days since their forced introduction, they had exchanged only a few words, polite formalities, mostly in the presence of her mother. Now, hearing her speak with such quiet intensity, he realized how little he truly knew about her. "You're not disturbing me," Marcus said, stepping forward slightly, though he kept his distance. "I was just thinking." Leora nodded, her expression thoughtful. She moved farther into the room, her steps slow and deliberate, as if every movement required careful consideration. Finally, she stopped near the window, her gaze drifting out to the alien landscape beyond. Thinking about how to escape, she asked, her tone flat, though there was a flicker of something sympathy, perhaps in her voice. Marcus blinked, caught off guard by her bluntness. Yes," he admitted after a moment. "I'd be lying if I said the thought hadn't crossed my mind." Leora let out a soft sigh, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't blame you." Her words, so simple yet filled with such understanding, struck Marcus deeply. He had expected her to be cold, perhaps even indifferent to his plight, but there was none of that here. Instead, there was only a quiet sorrow, a shared burden that neither of them had chosen. "I didn't want this either," she continued, her voice tinged with regret. "My mother has always been ambitious. Everything she does is for the future of our people, for the preservation of the bloodline. I've been groomed for this role my entire life, told that my purpose is to ensure the survival of our race." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "But I never wanted it. Not like this." Marcus took a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly at her words. Then why don't you leave, he asked gently. Why not escape her control? Leora's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands clasping together in front of her. It's not that simple, she whispered. I've tried to resist her before. But my mother, she's not just a ruler, she's a force of nature. No one defies her and survives. I've seen what happens to those who try. A chill ran down Marcus's spine at the gravity of her words. He had sensed the queen's power from the moment he met her, but hearing it confirmed by her own daughter made it all the more real. This was a woman who ruled with an iron fist, who crushed anyone who dared oppose her, even her own blood. I'm sorry, Leora said, her voice barely audible now. I'm sorry for what she's done to you. I didn't know she was planning this. Marcus shook his head, feeling a strange mixture of anger and gratitude. It's not your fault, he replied, his voice firm but gentle. You didn't force me to sign that contract. No, she agreed, her eyes meeting his again. But I could have warned you. I could have done something. Her guilt was palpable, and for a moment Marcus felt a pang of sympathy for her. She too was trapped, just like him. They were both pawns in the queen's grand game, both bound by forces they couldn't control. You don't have to do anything, Marcus said, his voice softening. We're both stuck in this mess, but I don't blame you. Leora's lips trembled slightly, as if she were holding back something, tears perhaps, or words she wasn't ready to say. For a long moment they stood in silence, the unspoken weight of their shared predicament hanging between them like a dark cloud. Then, without warning, Leora turned toward the window again, her gaze distant. I've been thinking, she said, her voice quiet but steady, about a way out. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. A way out. Leora nodded slowly. I don't know if it will work. And it's dangerous. If my mother finds out, it could cost us both our lives. His pulse quickened at the gravity of her words, but the thought of escape, of breaking free from the queen's control, was too tempting to ignore. What do you have in mind, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Leora hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her options, before finally speaking. There are secret tunnels beneath the palace, she began. Old passages that lead out into the city, and beyond that, into the wilderness. They've been sealed off for centuries, but I know where they are. Marcus stared at her, hope and fear warring within him. And you think we could use them to escape? It's possible, Leora said, though there was uncertainty in her voice. But it won't be easy. My mother's guards are everywhere, and if we're caught, there's no telling what she'll do. He didn't need to ask, he already knew the answer, death or worse. But the idea of remaining here, bound to the queen's will, was just as unbearable. We'll need supplies, Leora continued, her tone growing more urgent. Food, water, weapons if we can find them. And we'll have to move quickly, before my mother realizes what we're doing. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline course through him. It was a risk, yes, but it was also a chance at freedom, at escape from the queen's oppressive rule. I'm in, he said firmly, meeting Leora's gaze with determination, whatever it takes. Leora's expression softened slightly, a flicker of relief passing through her features. For the first time since they had met, Marcus saw something akin to hope in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know if I can do this alone. You won't have to, Marcus replied, his voice steady. We're in this together now. They stood in silence for a moment longer, the weight of their decision settling between them. The path ahead was uncertain and the risks were high, but for the first time since arriving in the Queen's kingdom, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. As Leora turned to leave, her movements slow and deliberate, Marcus called out to her. Leora. She paused, turning back to face him, her eyes questioning. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. Why risk everything to help me? For a long moment, Leora didn't respond. Her gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she spoke. Because no one should be forced to live like this, she said softly. Not you, not me, not anyone. With that, she turned and left the room, the door sliding shut behind her with a soft hiss. Marcus stood there in the quiet, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the risks. He knew the dangers that lay ahead. But in that moment, as the suns dipped below the horizon and darkness began to creep across the sky, he also knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone anymore. And together, they just might have a chance. The palace at night was a labyrinth of shadows, the flickering glow from the bioluminescent walls casting strange, moving patterns across the floor. Marcus had spent his days studying the twists and turns of the corridors, counting the number of steps between each intersection, silently mapping out his surroundings. But in the inky blackness of the late hours, when the palace slept and the guard's watch was supposedly light, the entire place felt alive with unseen eyes and hidden dangers. Leora had told him to wait until the third night after their last conversation. That's when the queen attends the council meetings deep in the inner sanctum, she had explained in a hushed voice, her eyes darting to the ever-watchful guards that followed them during the day. She's occupied for hours, and the guards' rotations are slow. It's the only time we'll have a chance. That night had come at last, and Marcus found himself standing near the entrance to one of the palace's lesser-used corridors, waiting in the silence. His heart thudded in his chest, a steady drumbeat of adrenaline and fear. His senses were on high alert, every creak of the building making him jump. He knew what was at stake. If they were caught tonight, there would be no escape, not this time, not ever. Suddenly a soft rustling came from the shadows ahead. Marcus's muscles tensed, his hand instinctively going to the small blade Leora had given him earlier, a simple, curved dagger, but it felt woefully inadequate against the queen's forces. But it was Leora who stepped out from the shadows, her green skin almost glowing in the faint light, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She moved with an unnatural grace, her every step soundless on the stone floor. Despite the danger, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm wash over him at the sight of her. "You came," Marcus whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Leora nodded, her expression determined but tinged with anxiety. "Of course. We don't have much time." She moved closer, her eyes scanning the corridor behind him. "The guards are stationed on the west side of the palace tonight. We should be able to make it to the tunnels unnoticed, but we need to move quickly." Marcus nodded, swallowing the lump of fear in his throat. "Lead the way." Without another word, Leora turned and began moving down the corridor, her steps light and quick. Marcus followed closely behind, his senses on high alert, every nerve in his body screaming for caution. They moved through the winding halls, avoiding the more populated sections of the palace, sticking to the narrow, forgotten pathways that Leora had memorized over the years. The silence between them was thick, but it was not the silence of strangers anymore. In the short time they had known each other, something had shifted. There was a shared understanding now, a bond forged in the fires of necessity and survival. Neither of them had chosen this path, but now they were walking it together, and in the quiet darkness of the palace, their shared determination was the only thing keeping them going. After what felt like an eternity of sneaking through the labyrinthine halls, they reached a set of heavy iron doors, hidden in a secluded alcove near the outer edge of the palace. The doors were ancient, their surface worn smooth by centuries of use, but they were sealed tight. "This is it," Leora whispered, her breath quickening with both urgency and apprehension. "These doors lead to the old passageways beneath the palace. They haven't been used in generations, but I found them in my mother's private archives. She doesn't think anyone knows about them." Marcus stepped closer, examining the doors. There were no visible handles or locks, just smooth iron and strange, intricate carvings. "How do we open them?" he asked, his voice low. Leora reached into the folds of her gown and produced a small, glowing orb. It pulsed with the same faint light as the palace walls, its surface swirling with energy. She pressed it against the center of the door, and with a low rumble, the carvings began to shift and move, the lines of the metal rearranging themselves as though alive. Slowly the doors creaked open, revealing a narrow, stone staircase descending into darkness. "After you," Leora said, a hint of a smile playing at her lips, though her eyes betrayed her nervousness. Marcus gave a short nod, his hand gripping the hilt of his dagger as he descended the stairs. The air grew cooler and damper the farther down they went, the sounds of the palace fading into an eerie silence. The steps were steep, and the walls around them seemed to close in the deeper they traveled, as if the palace itself were swallowing them whole. At the bottom of the staircase they emerged into a long, winding tunnel. The stone walls were rough and covered in moss, the floor uneven beneath their feet. Ancient symbols were carved into the walls, symbols Marcus couldn't read, but that seemed to hum with forgotten power. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic that Marcus couldn't place. "Where do these tunnels lead?" Marcus asked, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow space. "Out of the palace." Eventually Leora replied, her voice hushed. But first, they pass beneath the old parts of the city, areas that were abandoned long ago. There are hidden exits along the way, places we can use to slip out unnoticed. But it's dangerous. These tunnels haven't been maintained in centuries. Marcus nodded, keeping his eyes on the path ahead. I'll take dangerous over certain death any day. They moved through the tunnel, their footsteps barely audible on the rough stone. The passageway twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the underground labyrinth. At every turn, Marcus expected to hear the sound of guards, to see the Queen's soldiers bursting through the darkness, but so far they had been lucky. Still, the weight of the danger they were in pressed down on him with every step. After what felt like hours, they reached a wider section of the tunnel, where the walls opened into a small chamber. The air here was heavier, the metallic scent stronger. In the center of the chamber stood a large, rusted iron gate, its bars twisted and ancient. Beyond it, the tunnel split in several directions, each path leading into the unknown. This is where it gets tricky, Leora said, her brow furrowing in concentration. The tunnels branch out from here, but not all of them lead to safety. Some of these paths are dead ends literally. The Queen's ancestors used these tunnels for unsavory purposes. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Unsavory. Leora hesitated, glancing down at the ground. Prisoners. Exiles. Those who defied the Queen's will were sent down here and never came back. The tunnels are full of traps, deadfalls, and worse. If we take the wrong path. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus felt a cold shiver run down his spine. So how do we know which one is the right path? Leora stepped forward, her hand brushing against the rough stone wall. I studied the old maps from my mother's archives, but they were incomplete. Some of these tunnels have collapsed over time, but I think I remember the correct route. We'll have to trust our instincts. Marcus's eyes scanned the various paths, each one disappearing into darkness. There were no markings, no signs to indicate which way was safe. It was as though the tunnels themselves were designed to confuse and trap anyone who dared to enter. Let's hope your instincts are right, Marcus muttered, tightening his grip on his dagger. Without further hesitation, Leora led them toward the tunnel on the far left, her steps careful and measured. Marcus followed close behind, his eyes darting around, his senses on edge. Every sound, every drip of water, every distant echo felt like a potential threat. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the air grew colder, the walls damp with condensation. The narrow passage seemed to close in around them, the weight of the earth pressing down from above. Marcus's mind raced with thoughts of what might happen if the tunnel collapsed, if they were buried alive down here, forgotten in the darkness. But he couldn't dwell on that, not now. Suddenly a low rumble echoed through the tunnel, causing both Marcus and Leora to stop in their tracks. The sound was distant, but unmistakable, the sound of something heavy shifting deep within the earth. Leora's eyes widened in alarm. That's not good. Before Marcus could respond, the tunnel began to tremble. The walls shook violently, dust and small stones raining down from above. Marcus's heart leaped into his throat as the ground beneath them shifted. We have to move, Leora shouted, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rumbling earth. Without thinking, Marcus grabbed her arm and pulled her forward, running as fast as they could down the narrow tunnel. The walls continued to shake, the ceiling cracking and groaning under the pressure. Behind them, the sound of collapsing stone grew louder, closer. They raced through the darkness, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, the tunnel ahead twisting and turning unpredictably. Marcus's legs burned, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't. The only thing that mattered now was getting out, escaping before the tunnel came crashing down on top of them. Just when Marcus thought his legs might give out, they burst into a wider chamber, the tremors beginning to subside. The ceiling here was higher, the walls reinforced with ancient stone beams. They stopped, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both too winded to say anything. The dust in the air made it hard to breathe, and Marcus coughed, trying to clear his lungs. That was close, he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. Leora nodded, her hands trembling as she braced herself against the wall. Too close. They stood in silence for a moment longer, their shared relief palpable. But the danger wasn't over yet, and they both knew it. They still had to find their way out, still had to navigate the rest of the tunnels. After catching their breath, Leora straightened, her eyes scanning the chamber. This is it, she said quietly, her voice filled with cautious hope. "We're almost there. The exit should be just ahead." Marcus's heart leaped at her words. "Are you sure?" Leora nodded. "If my memory is right, we're close. Very close." With renewed determination, they pressed on, moving through the chamber and into a final tunnel. This one was shorter, the air here fresher, less oppressive. Marcus could feel it, the faint breeze of the outside world beckoning them forward. And then, at last, they saw it, a sliver of light at the end of the tunnel. The exit. They hurried toward it, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As they reached the opening, Marcus felt the weight of the palace, the queen, and everything they had endured begin to lift from his shoulders. But as they stepped out into the night, the cool air washing over them, Leora froze, her eyes widening in horror. Standing in the clearing beyond the tunnel was a group of the queen's elite guards, their silver armor glinting in the moonlight. At their head stood a tall, imposing figure, the captain of the guard, his expression cold and merciless. "Did you really think you could escape the queen?" the captain said, his voice like steel. "You're coming with us, both of you." Marcus's heart sank as the guards advanced, their weapons drawn. The hope of freedom that had seemed so close now felt like it was slipping away, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their situation. But Leora's eyes narrowed, a flicker of defiance flashing across her face. She stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "We're not going back," she said, her voice strong. "Not now, not ever." The captain's expression darkened. "Then you leave me no choice." The battle for their freedom had only just begun. The air between Marcus and Leora was tense, thick with the weight of what lay ahead. The gleaming figures of the queen's elite guards stood in stark contrast to the dark, overgrown wilderness surrounding them, their silver armor reflecting the cold light of the twin moons. The captain of the guard, tall and broad, his helmet crowned with the markings of the queen's most trusted enforcers, took a step forward. His eyes, though obscured by the visor, seemed to bore into Marcus and Leora with a grim finality. Marcus could feel the cold sweat on the back of his neck. The guard's movements were slow but deliberate, like predators circling prey. His hand instinctively tightened around the hilt of the dagger Leora had given him earlier. It felt small, almost useless, against the array of polished spears and energy rifles held by the guards. "We're not going back," Leora had said with defiance, her voice cutting through the still night like a blade. But now, facing the reality of their situation, Marcus could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The captain's threat hung in the air, an unspoken promise of violence if they resisted. "Leora, daughter of the queen," the captain's voice rang out, echoing against the trees that swayed gently in the breeze. "You are bound by blood and by law to the crown. Defiance will not be tolerated. Your actions tonight have consequences far beyond your own life." He paused, his attention shifting to Marcus, his words now colder, more measured. "And you, human, you've been marked by the queen's will. There is no escaping the contract you signed." The captain raised a hand, and the guards took a synchronized step forward, their boots crunching against the gravel of the clearing. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the otherwise silent night. Marcus's breath hitched as he glanced around, looking for any possible escape, any advantage they could use. But the forest around them was dense, the path ahead choked with thick vines and towering trees, their gnarled branches casting twisted shadows under the moonlight. "We can't outrun them," Leora whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "They know these lands far better than we do. But we might have one chance." Her eyes flicked to the tree line beyond the guards, where the forest grew thicker and wilder. Marcus's heart raced as he caught her meaning. The forest beyond was untamed, filled with ancient dangers, creatures, traps, and hazards that even the queen's elite forces would hesitate to enter. But it was also their only hope. He gave a barely perceptible nod. The captain's voice interrupted their silent exchange. "Surrender now, and your punishment will be merciful. Resist, and you'll face the queen's wrath." Marcus's hand tightened around Leora's wrist. Now he whispered. In an instant, they broke into a sprint. The guards reacted immediately. Shouts filled the air, and the sharp hiss of energy weapons crackled behind them as beams of light shot past, narrowly missing them. Marcus could feel the heat of one beam scorch the air near his arm, but he didn't slow down. His lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, his feet pounding against the uneven ground as they raced toward the dense forest. Leora was just ahead of him, her movements graceful and quick despite the underbrush that threatened to trip them up with every step. Behind them, the sound of boots crashing through the brush grew louder. The guards were fast, their armor clanking as they charged forward, undeterred by the thickening forest. "Keep moving," Leora shouted over her shoulder. "The deeper we go, the harder it will be for them to follow." Marcus nodded, though his breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. His legs screamed with exhaustion, but adrenaline kept him going. Branches whipped at his face, thorns tore at his clothes, but he pressed on. The sounds of pursuit were too close, the captain's voice barking orders as they pushed deeper into the forest. Suddenly the ground beneath them changed. What had been hard-packed dirt turned to soft, unstable earth, and Marcus's foot sank deep into a patch of slick mud. He stumbled, nearly falling, but Leora was there, grabbing his arm and pulling him upright before they lost any momentum. "This way," she called, veering sharply to the right, toward an even darker section of the forest. Marcus followed, his legs moving on pure instinct now, as the world around him became a blur of trees, vines, and the ever-looming threat of the Queen's guards. The forest was a labyrinth, its twisted paths growing narrower, the underbrush thicker with each step. The air was different here, heavier, laden with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient. "They won't follow us much farther," Leora panted, her breath ragged. "Not here." "Why?" Marcus gasped, struggling to keep pace. "Because even the Queen's men fear this place," she replied, her voice low, almost reverent. "This part of the forest is older than the city, older than the palace. There are things here, things even my mother won't disturb." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine at her words, but there was no time to question her further. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were fading, but not gone. The guards had slowed, their heavy boots clanking against the ground as they hesitated at the edge of this darker, more foreboding part of the forest. Leora skidded to a stop, her hand held up in a signal for silence. Marcus stopped beside her, his chest heaving, his ears straining to listen. The night was unnervingly quiet now. Even the distant calls of alien birds had fallen silent. Then, from the shadows of the trees, came a low, guttural growl. Marcus's heart nearly stopped. His eyes darted around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but all he could see were the shifting shadows of the forest. Another growl followed, closer this time, the sound rumbling through the underbrush. Leora's hand tightened on Marcus's arm. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And whatever happens, don't run." Marcus's pulse pounded in his ears, his muscles tense with the urge to flee. But he trusted Leora's instincts. Together they took slow, deliberate steps forward, deeper into the heart of the ancient forest. The air around them seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, a living presence that pressed down on them from all sides. The growls grew louder, more frequent, but they remained hidden in the shadows, as if waiting, watching. "They're testing us," Leora murmured, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Seeing if we're prey." Marcus swallowed hard, forcing himself to remain calm. His hand hovered near the dagger at his belt, though he knew it would be useless against whatever creatures lurked in these woods. Still, he kept his grip firm, the weight of the weapon a small comfort in the face of the unknown. For what felt like an eternity, they moved forward in silence, the tension between them thick enough to cut. The growls continued to circle them, but the creatures, whatever they were, did not attack. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for some unseen signal. Then, just as suddenly as the growls had started, they stopped. The air grew still, the oppressive presence that had surrounded them seeming to retreat. Marcus blinked in confusion, his senses still on high alert. Leora let out a slow, relieved breath. "They've left us," she whispered, though her voice was still wary. "For now." Marcus exhaled, his body sagging with exhaustion and relief. What were they?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Leora shook her head. "No one knows. They're as old as the forest itself. Some say they're the spirits of the land, others believe they're creatures from another time, another world. All I know is that they protect this part of the forest, and they don't attack unless provoked." Marcus nodded, though his mind was still reeling from the encounter. He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or more terrified by the idea of unseen forces watching them. deciding whether they were worthy of passage. "We should keep moving," Leora said, her voice firm. "We're not safe yet." They pressed on, though now their pace was slower, more cautious. The forest had shifted again, the shadows longer, the trees taller and more twisted. Strange plants glowed faintly in the darkness, their luminescence casting an eerie, greenish light over the underbrush. As they walked, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not by the guards or the creatures from earlier, but by the forest itself. It was as though the trees, the vines, the very earth beneath their feet were alive, aware of their presence. "We're getting close," Leora said after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's an old temple not far from here. It's been abandoned for centuries, but it's a safe place to rest. We can hide there until we figure out our next move." Marcus nodded, though his thoughts were still racing. The captain's words echoed in his mind, "You're marked by the Queen's will." He had been naive to think that he could simply run, that he could escape the reach of the Queen so easily. She had marked him, bound him to her through the contract, and no matter how far they ran, he knew that her power extended far beyond the walls of the palace. As they neared the temple, the forest opened into a small clearing. In the center stood a crumbling stone structure, its walls covered in moss and vines. The architecture was ancient, older than anything Marcus had seen in the Queen's city. It was clear that this place had once been important, sacred even, but now it was little more than a ruin, forgotten by time. Leora led them inside, her movements careful and deliberate. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp stone. Marcus could see faint carvings on the walls, symbols and figures that looked almost human, but not quite. "We'll be safe here for the night," Leora said, her voice echoing softly in the empty chamber. "The guards won't come this far." Marcus sank to the ground, his body aching with exhaustion. He leaned back against the cool stone wall, closing his eyes for a moment as he tried to steady his breathing. Leora sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. "We'll have to leave at first light. The Queen's forces will keep searching, and we can't stay in one place for too long." Marcus nodded, though his mind was still swirling with thoughts of what lay ahead. The Queen's reach was vast, her influence undeniable. But as he sat there in the quiet of the ancient temple, with Leora beside him, he felt something stir within him, something new. Hope. They had escaped the Queen's grasp, for now. And though the road ahead was dangerous, uncertain, and filled with peril, Marcus knew one thing for certain. They had each other. And together they might just have a chance at freedom. As the first faint light of dawn crept through the cracks in the temple walls, Marcus allowed himself to believe, if only for a moment, that they could outrun the Queen's tyranny. That their journey had only just begun, and that, somehow, they would find a way to forge a new path, one free of the chains that bound them both. The dawn broke gently over the ruins of the ancient temple, casting a soft glow over the moss-covered stone and creeping vines. The cold light of the twin suns spilled through the cracks in the temple's walls, slowly warming the chill of the night. Marcus stirred from his uneasy sleep, the weight of the previous night's escape still heavy on his mind. His body ached, every muscle sore from the relentless chase through the forest, but the flicker of hope that had ignited in his chest refused to be extinguished. Beside him, Leora was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the temple floor, her back to the crumbling stone wall. She gazed out through one of the openings in the temple, her silver hair catching the early light. There was a quiet strength in her, a calm that belied the fear and uncertainty that had plagued them for so long. Even in the shadows of her mother's tyranny, Leora had a fire in her, a resilience that Marcus admired deeply. He shifted, wincing as his sore muscles protested, and Leora turned to him with a small, knowing smile. "You look like you could use more rest," she said, her voice soft but teasing. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, letting out a low groan. "I don't think there's enough rest in the world for how I feel right now." Leora chuckled, but the sound was muted, weighed down by the gravity of their situation. Her eyes flicked to the opening in the temple again, scanning the dense forest beyond. "We'll need to move soon," she said, her tone more serious now. "The guards might not follow us into this part of the forest, but they won't stop searching. My mother won't stop until she finds us." Marcus nodded, pushing himself to his feet, despite the stiffness in his limbs. He knew she was right. The Queen's reach was vast, and though they had managed to escape the immediate danger, they were far from free. The Queen's elite guards were relentless, and Marcus had no doubt that they were still out there, hunting them. But as he looked at Leora, standing tall and resolute despite the exhaustion that lined her face, he felt a surge of determination. They had come this far farther than he had thought possible. They couldn't give up now. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. They gathered what little they had, a small pouch of food and water Leora had managed to steal from the palace, along with Marcus's dagger, and made their way out of the temple and into the forest. The ancient trees loomed above them, their twisted branches casting long shadows across the uneven ground. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of distant creatures. They walked in silence for a long time, the tension between them palpable. The forest was dense, and every step felt precarious, as though the very ground beneath them could shift at any moment. But despite the danger, Marcus found his mind drifting to Leora. She walked ahead of him, her movements graceful and sure, her emerald-green skin glowing faintly in the dappled sunlight. He had seen her in moments of strength and moments of vulnerability, and with each passing day his admiration for her grew. He had never expected to find an ally in the Queen's daughter, let alone someone he could trust so completely. But Leora had proven herself time and again, risking her own life to help him escape, guiding him through the treacherous paths of the forest, and now standing beside him as they faced an uncertain future. It wasn't just admiration, though. Marcus had known that for some time now. There was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable, that connected them. It was in the way she looked at him, the way her voice softened when they spoke in the quiet moments between danger. And in his heart, Marcus knew that his feelings for her were no longer just those of a grateful companion, they were something far more profound. As the hours passed, the landscape began to change. The dense forest gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance Marcus could see the outline of mountains, their jagged peaks rising high into the sky. The air grew cooler, the wind picking up as they made their way out of the thick woods and into the open terrain. "We're almost there," Leora said, her voice carrying over the wind. "There's a village on the other side of the mountains. It's small, isolated. They don't follow my mother's rule as closely there. We can rest, maybe find someone who can help us." Marcus nodded, though a part of him wondered if there was truly anyone left who could help them. The Queen's influence reached far and wide, and trust was a scarce commodity in this world. But he followed Leora without question, trusting her instincts as he had so many times before. They continued their journey into the foothills of the mountains, the path growing steeper and more treacherous. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. By the time they reached the base of the mountains, the sky had turned a deep, dusky purple, the twin moons rising once again to light their way. It was then, as they rested near a small stream, that Marcus saw something that made his heart leap into his throat. In the distance, above the mountains, was a faint but unmistakable glow, a light that did not belong to this world. It pulsed steadily, a beacon in the night sky, and Marcus felt a surge of hope so strong it almost knocked him off his feet. That's a ship," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Leora turned to look, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What?" Marcus pointed to the sky, his heart racing. "That's a human ship. I'd know those lights anywhere. It's Earth technology." Leora's eyes widened as she stared at the distant glow. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Marcus said, his voice filled with excitement. "They must be searching for me. My mission to this planet was diplomatic. If I didn't return, they'd send a search team." Leora's face softened, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Then, maybe we can get off this planet. Maybe we can be free." Marcus's heart swelled at the thought. Earth. Home. The idea seemed almost unreal after everything they had been through. But there it was, a ship from his world, a way back to the life he had thought he might never see again. They watched the ship's lights for a long moment, neither of them speaking. Then, without hesitation, Marcus reached into the small pouch at his waist and pulled out a small device, his emergency beacon. It had been his last lifeline, something he had clung to even when hope seemed lost. Now, with trembling hands, he activated it, sending a signal into the sky. "It'll take some time for them to pick up the signal," Marcus said, his voice shaky with anticipation. "But they'll come. I know they will." Leora looked at him, her expression unreadable. "And when they do?" Marcus met her gaze, his heart pounding. He had been so focused on escaping, on surviving, that he hadn't truly considered what would happen next. If they made it back to Earth, what then? Would Leora come with him? Could she? I don't know, he admitted softly. But we'll figure it out, together. The word together hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Leora's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus saw the tension in her shoulders ease. I've never left this planet, she said quietly, her voice laced with uncertainty. I don't even know what your world is like. Marcus smiled gently. It's different. But it's beautiful in its own way. And if you come with me, I'll show you. Leora's breath hitched, and for a long moment they simply stood there, the wind rustling the grass around them. The connection between them was undeniable now, no longer something they could ignore or push aside. Without thinking, Marcus reached out, taking Leora's hand in his. Her skin was warm, soft beneath his touch, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, her gaze searching his, as if she were looking for something, some reassurance, some promise that everything would be okay. I never expected this, Leora whispered, her voice trembling slightly. You came into my life when I thought there was no way out. And now. Marcus's heart raced as he looked into her eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the quiet strength that had carried her through so much. He had never imagined that he would feel this way, that he would find someone in the most unlikely of places, in the most unlikely of circumstances. Leora, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I never expected this either. But I know one thing for certain now, I can't imagine my life without you. Her breath caught, and for a moment the world around them seemed to fade away. The only thing that mattered was her, standing there in the moonlight, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. Then, without another word, Marcus leaned in, closing the distance between them. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid to shatter the fragile bond that had formed between them. But as their lips met, the warmth of the connection between them deepened, growing stronger with each passing moment. It was a kiss born of shared pain, of survival, of the unspoken feelings that had been building between them for so long. Leora's arms wrapped around Marcus's neck, pulling him closer, and Marcus's hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing against her smooth, green skin. The kiss lingered, slow and tender, the world around them forgotten as they gave in to the moment. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads resting against each other, both of them breathless, Leora let out a soft, almost disbelieving laugh. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way, she whispered, her voice trembling. Not after everything. Marcus smiled, his heart full. Neither did I. But here we are. For a long moment, they stood there in the quiet of the night, their hands still intertwined, their hearts beating as one. And in that moment, Marcus knew no matter what lay ahead, no matter how far they had to travel, or what challenges they still had to face, they would face it together. 2 days later, the ship from Earth arrived. It descended from the sky with a low hum, its sleek, silver hull gleaming in the light of the twin suns. Marcus and Leora stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as the landing ramp lowered and a group of human figures emerged, their expressions a mix of relief and curiosity. As Marcus stepped forward to greet them, he felt Leora's hand slip into his, and he gave her a reassuring squeeze. The journey back to Earth would be long, and the road ahead uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus felt a sense of peace. He wasn't running anymore. He had found something far more important than escape. He had found love. And as the ship's engines roared to life, lifting them into the sky, Marcus knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was all that mattered. The hum of the spaceship's engines was a low, steady presence that filled the cabin as Marcus leaned back in his seat, staring out the wide window at the vast expanse of space. Stars shimmered like distant beacons, tiny and infinite, spread across the endless black. The ship from Earth had picked them up 2 days earlier, its crew a mix of human and alien figures, all part of the diplomatic mission Marcus had originally been sent on. Yet, as he sat there now watching the universe unfold before him, the weight of their escape from the Queen's planet still hung over him. The journey back to Earth had begun, but it didn't feel like an ending, more like the beginning of something unknown and uncertain. Beside him, Leora sat quietly, her emerald green skin glowing faintly in the sterile light of the cabin. She had been mostly silent since they boarded the ship, her gaze often distant, her thoughts lost in the depths of space. She had never been off her planet, never seen the vastness of the galaxy. Now, here she was, surrounded by humans and technology she had only heard about in passing, her world a distant memory fading behind them. Marcus could feel her unease, though she tried to hide it. He had come to know her well enough by now to sense when she was holding something back. "You okay?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. Leora blinked, as if pulled from a distant thought, and turned to him with a small, hesitant smile. "I'm fine, just taking it all in." Marcus reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. Her fingers, warm and soft against his, tightened around his in response. The simple gesture of contact grounded them both, a reminder that they weren't alone in this journey. They had survived together against all odds, and now they were facing this new chapter as one. "It's overwhelming," Leora admitted after a moment, her voice barely audible above the hum of the ship. "All of this. Space, the stars, leaving my world behind. I've only ever known one place, one way of life. Now everything feels uncertain." Marcus nodded, understanding all too well. It's a lot to process. "I remember the first time I traveled beyond Earth, it felt like the universe was too big to even comprehend." Leora smiled faintly. "That's exactly it. It feels like I'm so small in all of this. Like everything I knew was just a tiny part of something much larger." "It's true," Marcus said, his voice thoughtful. "We're all small, really. But that doesn't mean we don't matter. You matter, Leora, to me." Her eyes softened at his words, and she looked down at their intertwined hands. "I never expected this," she whispered, echoing what she had said back on the planet. "Any of it. Meeting you, escaping my mother's control, leaving my home. But most of all," she hesitated, her voice catching slightly. "I never expected to feel this way." Marcus's heart skipped a beat at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He had felt it too, this growing connection between them, something deeper than survival, something that had taken root in the quiet moments they had shared. And now, sitting here with her in the quiet of the ship, far from the dangers that had once threatened them, he realized that this was something more than a fleeting connection born of necessity. It was love. "I know," Marcus said softly, his voice low and steady. "I didn't expect it either, but I'm glad it happened." Leora's gaze met his, and for a moment, the universe seemed to pause around them. The distant hum of the ship, the stars outside, the vastness of space, all of it faded into the background as they looked at each other. "I don't know what happens next," Leora whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "I don't know what my place is in your world, or if I even belong there." Marcus reached up, gently brushing a strand of her silver hair away from her face. His touch was tender, reassuring. "You belong with me," he said, his voice firm. "Wherever that is, wherever we go, you belong with me, Leora." Tears glistened in Leora's eyes, and she smiled a real, genuine smile that lit up her entire face. It was a smile that spoke of hope, of a future she had never dared to dream of before. "I want that," she whispered. "More than anything." Without another word, Marcus leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss. This time there was no hesitation, no fear, only the warmth of their shared feelings, the quiet promise of a future together. The kiss was soft and tender, filled with all the emotions they had kept hidden for so long. It was an affirmation of everything they had been through, everything they had fought for. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. Marcus smiled, his heart full. "We'll figure it out," he whispered. "We'll figure everything out. Together." Leora closed her eyes, leaning into him. Together. The journey to Earth was long, stretching over days as the ship moved through the galaxy. Each day brought them closer to Marcus's home, but also closer to the unknown. For Leora, the uncertainty of her place in this new world weighed heavily on her. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known: her planet, her people, even her identity as the Queen's daughter. But every time doubt crept in, Marcus was there, a steady presence beside her. He told her stories of Earth, of its cities and its oceans, its people and its cultures. He described the sprawling metropolises, the forests that stretched for miles, the vastness of the seas that reflected the sky. Leora listened intently, her mind filling with images of a world she had only ever heard about in passing. At night, when the ship was quiet and the stars outside seemed closer than ever, they would sit together in the observation deck, wrapped in each other's warmth, staring out into the endless expanse of space. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversations growing more intimate, more personal. They shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams for the future. And slowly, as the days passed, they began to build that future together, piece by piece. One evening, as they sat together in the dim light of the observation deck, Marcus felt a shift in the air. The stars outside seemed to shimmer more brightly, and the low hum of the ship felt almost like a lullaby. Leora leaned her head against his shoulder, her silver hair cascading over his arm. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you never came to my planet?" she asked softly. Marcus thought for a moment, his gaze fixed on the stars. "I used to," he admitted, "but not anymore, I think. I think everything happened for a reason. Meeting you, escaping the Queen, all of it. I don't know if I believe in fate, but it feels like we were meant to find each other." Leora smiled, her eyes closing as she relaxed into his embrace. "It feels like that to me too." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the universe spinning slowly around them. Then, after a long pause, Leora spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared, Marcus." He tightened his hold on her, his hand gently tracing patterns along her arm. "I know," he whispered. "I am too. But we're in this together. We'll face whatever comes together." Leora's breath hitched slightly, and she nodded, her body pressing closer to his. "As long as I have you, I'll be okay." "You'll always have me," Marcus promised, his voice steady and sure. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's warmth, the vastness of space their only witness. And in that quiet moment, as the stars continued to shimmer outside the window, Marcus realized that he no longer felt like a prisoner of circumstance. He had found someone who made all the struggles worth it. He had found love, in the most unexpected of places, and he knew that whatever challenges they faced next, they would face them together. When they finally arrived at Earth, the ship descended through the atmosphere in a controlled, graceful arc. The planet spread out below them, its blue oceans and green landscapes a welcome sight after the cold, vast emptiness of space. Marcus felt a rush of emotion as they approached: relief, excitement, and a strange sense of homecoming. Leora, sitting beside him, stared out the window in awe. Her eyes widened as the details of the planet came into focus: the cities, the forests, the mountains. She had heard Marcus describe it, but seeing it with her own eyes was something else entirely. "That's Earth," Marcus said softly, his voice filled with warmth. "My home." Leora's lips parted in wonder. "It's beautiful." The ship touched down smoothly on one of Earth's landing platforms, and as the doors opened, a rush of fresh, earthly air filled the cabin. Marcus turned to Leora, a smile tugging at his lips. "Welcome to Earth," he said, his voice full of meaning. Leora smiled back, her eyes bright. "I'm ready." Together, hand in hand, they stepped out of the ship and onto the soil of Marcus's home planet. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a new journey. And whatever lay ahead, they would face it together just as they had always promised. The universe was vast, filled with uncertainty and danger, but Marcus knew one thing for sure. He had found his home. Not just in the world around him, but in the person beside him. And that was all that mattered.